On November 24, 1987, a man walking off a rural road north of Mount Vernon, Washington, looked down into a ditch. He saw a body half covered in wet leaves, a teenage girl, shot once in the back of the head at close range. Her name was Tanya Van Cuylenborg. She was 18 years old. 2 days later, 65 miles away, a jogger found a second body under a bridge over the Snoqualmie River. A young man, beaten with rocks, strangled with a dog collar and a length of twine. Someone had shoved a pack of cigarettes down his throat. His name was Jay Cook. He was 20. They were high school sweethearts from Saanich, British Columbia. Together since their teens, the kind of couple everyone around them assumed would eventually get married. Jay's father ran a heating supply business. 6 days before their bodies were found, Jay volunteered him and Tanya for a simple errand. Drive down to Seattle, pick up a furnace part the business needed, stay one night, drive home the next day. Nothing about the trip should have been dangerous. They'd made runs like it before. They never made it back. When they didn't return, their families first contacted Canadian police in Saanich, who explained that since the couple was last confirmed in Washington state, the search fell to American agencies. That handoff across an international border cost valuable early hours, 2 law enforcement systems, 2 sets of evidence protocols, and 2 grieving families now forced to coordinate across a line on a map just to get updates on their own children. For 31 years, the man who did this to them walked free. He got married, got divorced, drove trucks for a living, lived less than 10 miles from where one of the bodies was found. Nobody ever knocked on his door. Then, in 2018, a genetic genealogist sat down at a computer with a DNA sample and a public ancestry website. 2 hours later, she had a name. If you think DNA solves crimes overnight, stay with me. Because this case sat in an evidence locker for 3 decades, while investigators had almost everything they needed and no way to use it. Here's what should make you angry before we even get to the trial. Investigators had semen collected from Van Cuylenborg's pants and from a vaginal swab within days of finding her body. That means, from November 1987 onward, they were sitting on the killer's genetic profile. They just had no database to check it against, and no technology to search one even if they did. For 3 decades, detectives worked this case the hard way. They chased down the couple's route, a ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, a stop for gas at a small deli, another ferry from Bremerton into Seattle. They found the van itself abandoned in a Bellingham alley, blood inside it, Van Cuylenborg's missing pants stuffed inside it. They found her camera, of all things, sitting in a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon. Someone had pawned a dead girl's camera for cash, and that thread went nowhere too. No tips ever came in on the man who actually did it. Not one. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He grew up in the area. He worked in the area. He lived his whole life within a short drive of where Jay Cook's body was dumped. And for 30 years, he was invisible to a task force that interviewed hundreds of people. Detective Jim Scharf inherited this case decades after the murders and worked it for years without a single solid lead. Every so often, a new forensic technique would surface. Investigators would resubmit the DNA, hoping the science had finally caught up. Every time, it came back inconclusive. The technology of the era could rule people out. It couldn't reach out into the general public and point to one man. What makes this case historic is what happened next, and how close in time it happened to another case you've probably heard of. In April 2018, police in California arrested a man named Joseph James DeAngelo, the suspect known for decades as the Golden State Killer, using this exact same untested technique. Crime scene DNA run against a public genealogy database. That arrest made international headlines. What most people don't know is that a forensics company called Parabon Nanolabs was already working a backlog of other cold cases using the same method. and Van Cuylenborg and Cook's case was one of them. By that point, the company had already run around 100 crime scene DNA profiles through GED Match and identified close to 20 other cases where the technique alone could point to a likely suspect. This wasn't a one-off miracle. It was the opening of a floodgate. Then, in the spring of 2018, everything changed for this specific case, and not because of a new witness or a deathbed confession. A genealogist named C.C. Moore ran the profile from Van Cuylenborg's case. She got 2 hits, both around the second cousin level. That meant each match probably shared great-grandparents with the killer. So she built out both family trees by hand, generation by generation, birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, until the 2 branches met at a single married couple. William Earl Talbott Sr. and a woman named Patricia Peters. That couple had 4 children. Only one of them was a son. 2 hours. That's how long it took Moore to go from a DNA profile with no name attached to a single specific man. Snohomish and Skagit County detectives didn't move on him immediately. They watched him first, built a quiet surveillance case, and waited for an opportunity to collect his DNA without ever approaching him directly. That opportunity came when he threw a paper coffee cup out of his vehicle. Detectives retrieved it and ran the DNA off the rim. It matched. His name was William Earl Talbott II, a 55-year-old truck driver from the Seattle area. He was arrested in May 2018, one county sheriff's department finally closing a case that had outlived multiple retired detectives. Ask yourself the obvious question. If the technology existed in 1990 instead of 2018, how many more years and how many more victims would this have cost other families waiting on cases just like this one? The case didn't just close a file, it changed how the genealogy industry operates to this day. Within a year of Talbott's arrest, GED Match rewrote its own terms of service, requiring users to actively opt in before police could search their DNA for law enforcement matches at all. A single truck driver's arrest reshaped the privacy rules for millions of people who'd only ever wanted to find long-lost cousins. In June 2019, a Snohomish County jury heard 2 weeks of testimony in front of Judge Linda Crease. It was, by that point, more than just a murder trial. It was the first time in the United States that genetic genealogy evidence had ever been presented to a jury at all. Prosecutors walked jurors through the entire chain of evidence. The palm print lifted from the van door, the semen recovered from Van Cuylenborg's body and clothing, and the DNA finally matched years later off a discarded coffee cup. A forensic pathologist described the cause of death for each victim in clinical detail. For Cook, ligature marks from the dog collar and twine, along with blunt trauma consistent with being struck repeatedly with rocks. For Van Cuylenborg, a single gunshot wound to the back of the skull, fired at close range. Nobody in that courtroom knew for certain whether the genetic genealogy technique would hold up under legal scrutiny. It did. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Then they found William Talbott II guilty on both counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Tanya's family described 3 decades of not knowing, followed by a strange mix of relief and renewed grief once Talbott's name finally surfaced. Jay's mother told the court that even with a conviction secured, nothing about it brought her son back, and that the wait for justice had already cost her family more than 3 decades. Tanya's brother stood up and said it was justice delayed, but not justice denied. He was close to being wrong. Here's what a lot of people never hear about this case. In December 2021, a Washington State Court of Appeals panel threw out both convictions. Not because of the DNA, not because of any doubt about who did it. They threw it out because of a single juror. During jury selection, a woman known in court records only as Juror 40, told the court she wasn't sure she could be impartial. She cited past trauma and said that, as a new mother, hearing testimony about violence against a young woman might affect her judgment. That's about as clear a warning sign as a juror can give. The defense didn't use one of its available strikes to remove her. The judge let her stay on the panel anyway. She sat through the full trial and voted guilty along with the other 11 jurors. Here's the part that confuses most people watching this unfold, so let's break it down plainly. During jury selection, each side gets a limited number of what are called peremptory challenges, meaning they can remove a certain number of potential jurors without giving any reason at all. Talbott's defense still had strikes available when Juror 40 raised her hand and admitted she might not be impartial. They chose not to use one on her. Under Washington law, once a defense team accepts a jury panel without exhausting its own tools to fix a known problem, it generally forfeits the right to raise that exact problem later on appeal. 3 appellate judges initially ruled that seating Juror 40 was enough by itself to throw out a double murder conviction built on DNA evidence that took 31 years and a groundbreaking new forensic technique to develop. Prosecutors were given until January 2022 to ask Washington's Supreme Court to step in, or the state would have had to retry the entire case from scratch 3 decades after the crime, with witnesses aged and evidence long since scattered. Think about what that means. A man linked to a double murder by his own DNA, with no other suspect ever identified, came within one appellate ruling of walking out of prison on a jury selection technicality that had nothing to do with his guilt. The state appealed. In December 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled unanimously and reinstated both of Talbott's convictions. They leaned on that same peremptory challenge logic. His own defense team hadn't done what the law required to preserve the objection and had accepted the jury panel as presented. In plain terms, the courts found the defense had the tool to fix the problem sitting right in front of them and chose not to use it. 2 life sentences, reinstated. But it took a year of appeals, a full round of oral arguments in front of the state's highest court, and a family that had already waited 31 years. Waiting all over again to find out if a jury selection error was going to hand a killer his freedom. Even after the Supreme Court ruling, the case wasn't fully closed. It went back down to the Court of Appeals to deal with the other issues Talbott had raised. Arguments about prosecutorial statements during closing arguments, about how his own trial attorneys handled a forensic analyst named Lisa Collins, who testified about the DNA analysis itself. Talbott's team argued she should have been questioned more aggressively about a second, unidentified male DNA profile recovered from the same vaginal swab. None of it changed the outcome. The convictions have stood since. If you think our justice system moves too slowly to actually protect victims' families, you're not wrong. This is what that looks like from the inside. Here's what Talbott's defense argued at trial, with a straight face, in front of a jury that had already seen the DNA results. They didn't deny the DNA. They couldn't. His palm print was on the back door of the van. His DNA matched the semen recovered from Van Cuylenborg's body. So the defense's strategy was simple. Yes, there was sex, but that doesn't prove murder. They argued Van Cuylenborg could have consented. They pointed out there was no evidence of vaginal trauma, no ligature marks proving she'd been restrained. They noted an unidentified second male DNA profile turned up in the same vaginal swab, and argued that meant someone else could have been involved too. For Jay Cook, the defense leaned even harder into doubt. No DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence at all tied Talbott to Cook's murder. No weapon was ever recovered either. Cook was strangled with a dog collar and twine, and there was never any evidence Talbott owned a dog or had access to one. The prosecution's entire theory for Cook rested on inference. The two victims traveled together, so whoever killed one must have killed both. Talbott never testified in his own defense. He never took the stand to explain the DNA, or where he was that November night in 1987, or how his palm print ended up on the back door of a van belonging to two people he claimed he'd never harmed. His own sister later told reporters that he'd been violent growing up, describing incidents involving a family pet and an allegation of assault against a young relative. None of that was presented at trial. It's simply the picture that emerged once his name became public. The jury didn't buy it. 12 people looked at that argument and returned a guilty verdict on both counts anyway. 2 life sentences later, verdicts reinstated by the state's highest court, William Talbott II is exactly where he belongs. It took 31 years, a coffee cup, and one genealogist with 2 hours to spare.